The desert wind howls across an endless sea of sand. In the distance, tanks burn under a merciless sun. Somewhere in the chaos, a commander makes a decision that will cost thousands of lives, or save them. This is not just another story about World War II. This is a deep dive into the untold realities, strange habits, brilliant tactics, and hidden contradictions of the men who led Germany's war machine. From daring battlefield improvisations to moments of doubt behind closed doors, you are about to uncover 20 little-known facts about German commanders that history books rarely highlight. Some were tactical geniuses, others were deeply flawed, but all of them shaped the course of the war in ways most people never fully realize. The image most people have of German commanders in World War II is often rigid, cold, calculating, and blindly loyal. But reality paints a far more complex picture. Take Erwin Rommel, for example, known as the Desert Fox. While he became a legend for his bold maneuvers in North Africa, what many don't realize is that Rommel often operated with minimal communication with Berlin. He relied heavily on instinct, improvisation, and speed. In several documented cases, he advanced far beyond supply lines, fully aware that if his gamble failed, his forces would be stranded in the desert. It was not recklessness, it was calculated desperation. Rommel's leadership style also stood in stark contrast to the stereotype of German command rigidity. He frequently visited the front lines, sometimes exposing himself to enemy fire just to better understand the battlefield. Soldiers respected him, not just for his skill, but because he shared their risks. British troops, surprisingly, also admired him. There are accounts of Allied soldiers referring to Rommel with a level of respect rarely given to enemy commanders. But not all German commanders were like Rommel. Heinz Guderian, the architect of blitzkrieg tactics, had a very different approach. Guderian believed in speed, coordination, and overwhelming force, but he was also known for clashing directly with his superiors, including Adolf Hitler himself. During the invasion of the Soviet Union, Guderian repeatedly argued against halting tank advances for political objectives. He saw war as a matter of efficiency, not ideology. These disagreements would eventually cost him his command, at least temporarily. One of the lesser-known facts about Guderian is that he often ignored direct orders when he believed they were strategically flawed. This wasn't just arrogance, it was a reflection of how fluid and chaotic the German command structure could be. Contrary to popular belief, not all German officers blindly followed orders. Some actively resisted them, though rarely on moral grounds, more often due to tactical disagreements. Then there's Friedrich Paulus, whose name is forever tied to the catastrophe at Stalingrad. Unlike Rommel or Guderian, Paulus was not a bold risk-taker. He was methodical, cautious, and deeply loyal to the chain of command. This personality trait would prove disastrous. As Soviet forces encircled his army during the Battle of Stalingrad, Paulus repeatedly requested permission to retreat. Each time, Hitler refused, and each time, Paulus obeyed. What many don't know is that Paulus was promoted to field marshal during the siege, a symbolic gesture by Hitler. No German field marshal had ever surrendered before, and the implication was clear. Paulus was expected to die rather than surrender. But in a shocking break from tradition, he chose to surrender anyway, saving what remained of his starving and frozen troops. It was a decision that shocked Germany and marked a turning point in the war. Not all commanders were defined by their battlefield decisions. Some were shaped by their personal contradictions. Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most brilliant strategists, masterminded the plan that led to the Secoute of France in 1940. His innovative approach, attacking through the Ardennes forest, caught the Allies completely off guard. It was a move considered too risky by many, yet it succeeded beyond expectations. However, Manstein's legacy is deeply controversial. While he demonstrated exceptional military skill, he was also complicit in the broader war effort that included war crimes. Like many German commanders, his story raises difficult questions about the line between professional military duty and moral responsibility. Another fascinating figure is Karl Donitz, the mastermind behind Germany's U-boat campaign in the Atlantic. Donitz believed in the wolf pack tactic, submarines hunting in coordinated groups to overwhelm Allied convoys. It was devastatingly effective in the early years of the war. At one point, Britain was on the brink of collapse due to supply shortages caused by U-boat attacks. What's less known is that Donitz believed in the importance of naval warfare, even when resources were clearly shifting toward land and air battles. His persistence kept the U-boat program alive longer than many thought possible. In the final days of the war, after Hitler's death, it was Donitz, not a politician or army general, who briefly became the leader of Germany. While some commanders rose to prominence, others operated in the shadows. Albert Kesselring was one of Germany's most capable defensive commanders. In Italy, he orchestrated a series of strategic retreats that delayed Allied advances for months. His ability to turn difficult terrain into a defensive advantage earned him respect even among his enemies. Yet Kesselring's story, like many others, is complicated. After the war, he was tried for war crimes related to actions in Italy. His defense was that he was simply carrying out military duties, a claim echoed by many German officers during post-war trials. One of the most surprising aspects of German commanders is how often they disagreed with each other. The German high command was far from unified. Personal rivalries, conflicting strategies, and ideological tensions created an environment where decisions were often influenced by ego as much as logic. This internal friction sometimes weakened Germany's effectiveness, especially as the war dragged on. For instance, tensions between commanders on the Eastern Front often led to disjointed operations. Some prioritized holding territory at all costs, while others advocated for tactical retreats to preserve forces. These disagreements became more pronounced as the tide of war turned against Germany.
And then there's the myth of total efficiency. German commanders are often portrayed as flawless military minds, but the reality is far messier. Logistics failures, communication breakdowns, and underestimation of enemy capabilities plagued even the most experienced leaders. The invasion of the Soviet Union is a prime example. Many commanders believed the campaign would be over in a matter of months. They were disastrously wrong. Winter caught them unprepared. Supply lines stretched thin. Equipment failed in freezing temperatures. Soldiers suffered immensely. These weren't just failures of planning, they were failures of imagination. German commanders underestimated the scale, resilience, and determination of their opponent. Despite these setbacks, some commanders adapted remarkably well. Improvisation became a survival tool. Field decisions often mattered more than orders from Berlin. In many cases, junior officers and frontline commanders played crucial roles in holding the line or launching counterattacks. Another little-known fact is how much German commanders relied on captured equipment. Especially on the Eastern Front, they frequently used Soviet tanks and weapons when their own supplies ran low. This adaptability highlighted both their resourcefulness and the growing strain on Germany's war machine. There were also moments of unexpected humanity. While the war was marked by brutality, there are documented instances of German commanders showing restraint or even compassion. Some allowed temporary ceasefires to evacuate wounded soldiers. Others treated captured enemy officers with a level of respect that contrasted sharply with the overall violence of the conflict. But these moments were exceptions, not the rule. The broader reality of the war, especially on the Eastern Front, was one of extreme brutality. Commanders operated within a system that often encouraged or tolerated harsh measures. As the war progressed, the pressure on German commanders intensified. Resources dwindled, Allied forces grew stronger, strategic options became more limited. Decisions that once seemed bold now appeared desperate. By the final years of the war, many commanders found themselves fighting a losing battle, not just against the enemy, but against the realities of their own situation. Some continued to follow orders to the end. Others began to question the direction of the war. A few even became involved in resistance efforts against Hitler, though these were rare and dangerous. What makes these stories so compelling is not just the scale of the war, but the human element behind it. These were men making decisions under immense pressure, often with incomplete information and impossible choices. Their actions shaped the lives of millions and the course of history itself. And this is only the beginning. The war did not move in straight lines. It twisted through forests, froze in endless winters, and collapsed entire armies in a matter of days. And behind every sudden breakthrough or catastrophic defeat, there were decisions, often made in isolation, under pressure, and sometimes in direct defiance of orders. As we continue, the stories of German commanders become even more unpredictable, revealing not just military brilliance, but moments of hesitation, deception, and quiet rebellion. One of the most striking and lesser-known aspects of German command was how frequently commanders operated under psychological strain that bordered on collapse. Take Gerd von Rundstedt, one of the most senior officers in the German army. By the later years of the war, Rundstedt had seen too much, too many failed offensives, too many unrealistic orders from Berlin. At one point, after being asked what should be done on the Western Front as Allied forces advanced after D-Day, he reportedly responded with a blunt and almost surreal answer: "Make peace, you fools." This was not a man lacking loyalty, it was a man who had reached the limits of reason. Rundstedt was dismissed and reinstated multiple times throughout the war, a reflection of how even the highest-ranking commanders were caught in a cycle of usefulness and expendability. His story reveals a truth often overlooked. German command was not just about strategy, it was about surviving within a system that punished honesty. Contrast this with Walther Model, known as Hitler's fireman. Whenever a front was collapsing, Model was sent in to stabilize it. He specialized in defensive warfare, improvising under extreme pressure. What made Model unique was his ability to restore order in chaos, often using a combination of strict discipline and rapid decision-making. But Model's effectiveness came at a cost. He was deeply loyal to Hitler, more so than many of his peers. While others questioned orders, Model carried them out with relentless determination. This loyalty earned him trust, but also tied his legacy to some of the war's most desperate and ultimately futile operations. In the end, as Germany collapsed, Model chose suicide rather than surrender, a decision that reflected both his personal code and the grim reality faced by many German commanders. Then there is Ernst Busch, whose downfall illustrates how dangerous blind obedience could be. During the Soviet summer offensive of 1944, known as Operation Bagration, Busch commanded Army Group Center. Despite clear signs of an impending massive Soviet attack, he followed Hitler's orders to hold positions at all costs. The result was catastrophic. Soviet forces encircled and destroyed large portions of his army, leading to one of the greatest defeats in German military history. Busch was removed from command, but by then, the damage was irreversible. His case highlights a recurring theme: the inability or unwillingness of some commanders to adapt when reality contradicted orders. Yet not all commanders accepted this fate passively. Some developed subtle ways to resist. Johannes Blockowitz is a particularly interesting example. While serving in occupied Poland, Blockowitz formally protested against SS atrocities, documenting them in reports sent up the chain of command. These reports were largely ignored, and he was sidelined as a result.
Blaskewitz's actions were rare. Most commanders either remained silent or focused solely on military objectives. His story does not change the broader reality of the war, but it does complicate the narrative. It shows that even within a system defined by obedience, there were individuals who recognized the moral consequences of their environment. though their ability to act on it was limited. Another overlooked reality is how often German commanders misjudged their enemies, not out of ignorance, but due to ingrained assumptions. Early in the war, many believed that Soviet forces lacked the capability for complex operations. This belief persisted even after evidence suggested otherwise. By the time large-scale offensives like Operation Bagration unfolded, it was too late. Similarly, in the West, some commanders underestimated the speed and coordination of Allied forces after the Normandy landings. The rapid breakout from the beachhead caught many off guard, leading to chaotic retreats and missed opportunities to regroup. But perhaps one of the most fascinating dynamics within German command was the constant tension between the army and the SS. While both served the same regime, their priorities and methods often clashed. Army commanders, trained in traditional military doctrine, sometimes found themselves at odds with SS units that operated with ideological motivations and brutal tactics. This friction occasionally led to operational inefficiencies. Coordination broke down, trust eroded. In some cases, commanders had to navigate not just the enemy, but competing forces within their own side. It was a hidden layer of conflict that rarely appears in simplified accounts of the war. Meanwhile, innovation continued, even as the situation deteriorated. German commanders were among the first to experiment with combined arms tactics, integrating infantry, armor, and air support in ways that would influence military doctrine for decades. But innovation was not always enough to compensate for dwindling resources. Late in the war, desperation led to increasingly unconventional strategies. Some commanders relied on ad hoc battle groups, known as Kampfgruppen, formed from whatever units were available. These groups lacked the cohesion of standard formations, but offered flexibility in rapidly changing situations. It was a sign of both ingenuity and decline. Another little-known aspect is how communication challenges shaped decisions. Contrary to the image of a perfectly coordinated war machine, German commanders often dealt with incomplete or delayed information. Radio communications could be intercepted or disrupted. Orders from high command sometimes arrived too late to be relevant. In such conditions, local commanders had to make critical decisions without guidance. This autonomy could be a strength or a weakness. In some cases, it allowed for rapid adaptation. In others, it led to disjointed efforts and missed opportunities. The effectiveness of a commander often depended on their ability to navigate uncertainty. And then there were moments of sheer unpredictability. Weather, terrain, and chance played roles that no plan could fully account for. A sudden snowstorm could halt an offensive. A flooded river could delay reinforcements. In these moments, the difference between success and failure often came down to how quickly a commander could respond. One such example involves Hasso von Manteuffel, who demonstrated remarkable adaptation during the later stages of the war. Known for his calm demeanor under pressure, Manteuffel often relied on deception and maneuver rather than brute force. He understood that by this point, Germany could not win through sheer strength. It had to rely on precision and timing. But even the most skilled commanders could not escape the larger trajectory of the war. By 1944 and 1945, Germany was fighting on multiple fronts against enemies with overwhelming industrial and numerical advantages. The margin for error had vanished. Some commanders began to focus not on victory, but on survival of their troops and sometimes of themselves. Others continued to pursue objectives that had long ceased to be achievable. This divergence in mindset created further inconsistencies in how the war was fought. There is also the question of legacy. After the war, many German commanders sought to shape how they would be remembered. Memoirs were written, narratives were constructed. Some emphasized their professionalism and downplayed their association with the regime. Others remained silent. Historians have spent decades examining these accounts, comparing them with archival records and first-hand testimonies. The result is a more nuanced understanding, but also an acknowledgement that some aspects may never be fully known.
What becomes clear, however, is that German commanders were not a monolithic group. They differed in personality, strategy, loyalty, and perspective. Some were innovators, others were traditionalists. Some questioned authority, others embraced it completely. And perhaps most importantly, they were all operating within a system that increasingly demanded the impossible. As the war tightened its grip, the space for independent thought shrank. Decisions became more constrained, consequences became more severe. Yet even in these conditions, moments of individuality, both brilliant and tragic, continued to shape events on the battlefield. By the final phase of the war, the illusion of control had completely shattered. The fronts were collapsing, cities were burning, and the once confident German command structure was now operating in a constant state of crisis. Yet in a paradoxical way, it was in this moment of collapse that some of the most revealing and least discussed stories about German commanders began to emerge. The war was no longer about expansion, it was about delay, survival, and for some, redemption.
One of the most telling examples of this shift can be seen in Gotthard Heinrici, a commander often overshadowed by more famous names, yet arguably one of the most effective defensive strategists Germany had. Heinrici understood something that many others failed to grasp in time. The war could not be won, but it could be managed. As Soviet forces advanced toward Germany itself, Heinrici perfected a method of elastic defense. Instead of rigidly holding front lines, he would withdraw troops just before massive Soviet artillery bombardments, allowing enemy fire to fall on empty positions. Then, once the barrage ended, his forces would return to engage weakened Soviet units. It was a simple concept, but it required precise timing and the courage to disobey standing orders, because Hitler had explicitly forbidden retreats. Heinrichi's quiet defiance saved thousands of lives and delayed Soviet advances at critical moments. But it also placed him in constant danger, not from the enemy, but from his own leadership. His story reveals a pattern that became more common in the final months: commanders bending orders not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. Meanwhile, others remained trapped in a different mindset. Ferdinand Schörner represented the extreme opposite. Known for his Gestapotis and unwavering loyalty, Schörner enforced discipline with brutal measures. Soldiers accused of desertion were executed on the spot. Units were ordered to hold positions regardless of the cost. To Hitler, Schörner was exactly the kind of commander the collapsing Reich needed: ruthless, obedient, and relentless. But to many of his own men, he was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. His leadership style reflected a belief that fear could replace strategy, that control could be maintained through force alone. It was a belief that ultimately failed. At the same time, something else was happening beneath the surface, something far more dangerous to the regime than any Allied advance. Doubt was spreading. Not openly, not in speeches or official reports, but in quiet conversations, in delayed orders, in subtle decisions that deviated just enough from what was expected. Some commanders began to prioritize the survival of their troops over the demands of Berlin. Others started to question whether continuing the fight made any sense at all. One of the most complex figures in this phase was Albert Speer. Although not a battlefield commander, Speer held immense influence over Germany's war production. As the situation deteriorated, Hitler issued the infamous Nero Decree, an order to destroy Germany's infrastructure to prevent it from falling into Allied hands. Speer quietly resisted. Instead of carrying out the order, he deliberately slowed and sabotaged its implementation. Factories, bridges, and essential facilities were preserved, decisions that would later play a crucial role in Germany's post-war recovery. Speer's actions were not those of a traditional military commander, but they reflected the same pattern seen among some officers. a shift from blind obedience to calculated resistance. Yet resistance had its limits. For every act of quiet defiance, there were others who doubled down on loyalty. The fragmentation within German command became more pronounced as the end approached. Some units fought to the last man, others surrendered at the first opportunity. There was no longer a unified approach, only individual decisions made in rapidly changing circumstances. Then there were commanders caught in situations where no decision could be justified. Dietrich von Saucken faced one such moment during the Soviet advance into East Prussia. With civilian populations trapped in the path of the Red Army, Saucken had to choose between following orders to hold defensive positions or diverting resources to facilitate evacuations. He chose the latter. Against expectations, he organized the evacuation of thousands of civilians, prioritizing their escape over strict military objectives. It was a rare instance where humanitarian considerations took precedence in the chaos of total war. And it came at a cost. Military positions weakened, and the retreat became even more chaotic. But for those who escaped, the decision meant survival. Another little-known reality of this period is how fragmented communication had become. Entire units were cut off, operating without clear orders. Commanders had to rely on instinct, outdated intelligence, or sometimes pure guesswork. In such an environment, traditional hierarchies began to lose their meaning. Leadership became personal. A commander's ability to inspire, adapt, and make decisions under uncertainty mattered more than rank or doctrine. Some rose to the challenge, others collapsed under the pressure. And then there were those who saw the inevitable and chose to act accordingly. As Allied forces closed in from both east and west, surrender became an increasingly unavoidable topic. But surrender was not a simple decision. It carried risks, not just from the enemy, but from one's own side. Orders to fight to the last were still in effect. Disobedience could mean execution. Despite this, some commanders began to negotiate local surrenders, often without authorization. These decisions saved lives, but they also created inconsistencies across the front. While one unit laid down its arms, another just kilometers away might continue fighting fiercely.
The result was a chaotic and uneven collapse. In Berlin, the situation reached its final stage. The once powerful command structure had been reduced to isolated pockets of resistance. Orders were still being issued, but they were increasingly disconnected from reality. And yet, even in these autumn moments, decisions continued to shape outcomes. Some commanders chose to stay and fight. Others attempted to break out. A few simply disappeared into the chaos. Each choice carried consequences, not just for themselves, but for the soldiers under their command. What makes this phase of the war so compelling is not just the scale of destruction, but the clarity it brings. Stripped of illusions, the true nature of leadership is revealed, not in grand victories, but in impossible decisions made when all options lead to loss. The stories of these commanders are not just about strategy or tactics. They are about human behavior under extreme conditions, about how individuals respond when the systems they rely on begin to collapse. And perhaps most importantly, they force us to confront uncomfortable questions. What does loyalty mean when the cause is lost? What is the responsibility of a commander when orders no longer align with reality? And how do history and memory judge those who acted and those who did not? As the war reached its end, these questions became unavoidable, and the answers, often incomplete, sometimes contradictory, continue to shape how we understand this period today. The war ended not with a single moment, but with a series of silences. Guns stopped firing. Orders stopped arriving. Entire fronts simply dissolved. And in that void, the final chapter of German commanders began, not on the battlefield, but in the aftermath. This is where reputations were rewritten, truths were contested, and the final untold facts emerged, not from combat, but from memory, judgment, and survival. For many commanders, the end of the war was not the end of their story. Karl Donitz, who had briefly taken leadership after Hitler's death, found himself presiding over a defeated nation in its autumn days. His role shifted overnight, from directing naval warfare to negotiating surrender. It was a transition almost without precedent. Donitz attempted to manage a partial surrender to Western allies while continuing to resist Soviet forces in the east, hoping to buy time for German soldiers and civilians to flee westward. This decision, often overlooked, reflected a final strategic calculation, not to win, but to control the terms of defeat. But control was an illusion. Soon, the machinery of accountability began to turn. The Nuremberg trials became the stage where many of these commanders, or those connected to them, would face judgment. For the first time in modern history, military and political leaders were held internationally accountable for their actions during war. Some, like Albert Speer, managed to navigate this new reality with a carefully constructed narrative. Speer portrayed himself as a technocrat, someone focused on production, detached from ideology. He admitted a level of responsibility, expressed remorse, and avoided the death sentence, receiving instead a prison term. Others were not as fortunate. Wilhelm Keitel, who had served as a chief military advisor and was known for his unwavering obedience to Hitler, became a symbol of blind loyalty. During the trials, Keitel repeatedly defended his actions as following orders, a defense that would become infamous. It did not save him. He was sentenced to death. These trials revealed something deeper than individual guilt. They exposed the inner workings of a system where obedience had been elevated above judgment, where the line between duty and complicity had been blurred, sometimes deliberately. But not all legacies were decided in courtrooms. Many German commanders who survived captivity returned to civilian life and began writing their own versions of history. Memoirs became a powerful tool, not just for reflection, but for shaping perception. Figures like Erich von Manstein published accounts that emphasized military professionalism while minimizing or ignoring the political context in which they operated. These writings influenced generations. For years, a narrative persisted that separated the German military, the Wehrmacht, from the crimes of the Nazi regime. It painted commanders as apolitical professionals, trapped in a system beyond their control. Only later did historians begin to challenge this view, uncovering evidence that many commanders were not just participants, but enablers. This shift in understanding is one of the most important untold facts of all, not about what happened during the war, but about how it was remembered afterward. And memory, as it turns out, can be as complex as war itself. Some commanders became case studies in contradiction. Erwin Rommel, for example, was posthumously linked to the resistance movement against Hitler. Accused of involvement in the failed July 20 plot, Rommel was forced to take his own life. In death, his image transformed, from loyal commander to reluctant dissenter.
His legacy remains debated to this day. Was he a man who saw the truth too late, or someone who quietly opposed the regime from within? The answer is not simple, and perhaps that is precisely the point. Because the final truth about German commanders is this: there is no single narrative that defines them. Some were brilliant tacticians who changed the nature of warfare. Others were rigid traditionalists who failed to adapt. Some questioned orders, others enforced them without hesitation. A few resisted, in small and often ineffective ways. Many complied, whether out of belief, fear, or ambition. And all of them operated within a system that demanded total commitment, while offering little room for dissent. One of the most overlooked aspects of their legacy is how their decisions influenced modern military thought. Concepts like mobile warfare,
decentralized command, and combined arms operations did not disappear with the Sukkot of Germany. They were studied, analyzed, and in many cases adopted by other nations. The irony is striking. Lessons born in one of history's most destructive conflicts would go on to shape military strategies for decades to come. But beyond strategy and doctrine, there is a more human legacy, one that is harder to quantify. The stories of these commanders force us to confront uncomfortable realities about leadership, responsibility, and choice. They show us that skill and morality do not always align, that intelligence does not guarantee wisdom, and that the ability to command does not necessarily mean the ability to question. In the end, what defines these men is not just what they achieved, but the context in which they achieved it. They were products of their time, their training, and their environment, but they were also individuals capable of making decisions, sometimes extraordinary, sometimes catastrophic. And those decisions mattered. They shaped battles, they influenced outcomes, they determined who lived and who did not. As we step back from these stories, one final thought remains. History is not just a record of events, it is a record of choices. And the true weight of those choices is not always visible in the moment they are made. Sometimes it takes years, decades, even generations to fully understand their impact. So now, after everything you've seen, after the untold facts, the hidden decisions, and the human stories behind the uniforms, we want to hear from you. What surprised you the most about these German commanders? Was it their brilliance, their contradictions, or the difficult choices they faced in the final moments of the war? Leave a comment below and include the keyword command so we know you stayed with us until the very end. And if you found this story compelling, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more deep, untold war stories just like this. Keep watching, because the next videos appearing on your screen right now will take you even further into the hidden truths of history.